I'm Dan Lee from Black Forest Landscape Design Studio. Thanks for watching my video on how to measure for landscape design. I've been measuring projects for about 20 years now, or a little bit more, and usually between 80 to 90, maybe even 100 projects per year I measure, and usually all with just a tape measure. And so here's what you'll need and how I do it. I like to have a clipboard. The bigger the better. Usually my sheet of paper is 11 by 17, which is a good size. So the clipboard needs to be a little bit bigger than that, and you can get it from a typical art store like Meininger's in Denver. Colored pens. I use colored pens a lot. I like the Pilot Precise V5. Graph paper. I've even gotten to printing my own graph paper from my printer. That way I can control the spacing of the graph paper and also how blue those lines are. I make it kind of faint, and so it's not quite as crisp, but just so I can get those nice straight lines using the graph paper. A camera is also a good idea, and typically everyone has one on their phone now. Also use the 35-foot steel tape measure, and I like these Stanley Power Locks. They're really simple. They're very inexpensive, typically online. You can pick them up from $11 to $20. I like these better than the Big Fat Maxes or some of the other tape measures I've tried. The Big Fat Max, I could not get the lock to work properly while I was out there, especially with one hand. They're just too strong. Some of the other ones, the locks are really the key thing. It needs to be able to lock securely and quickly and easily with one hand when you have that tape measure fully extended. Then I'll also carry either a 100-foot, 300-foot tape measure, kind of picture bottom there. Then I usually use a 10-inch to 12-inch timber spike or a screwdriver, something like that, to hold those large tape measures in place. What to measure? So I always start by measuring the house. Houses are typically built on 90 degrees, or it's obvious that they're not. Sometimes they'll have 45 bay windows, or they could have a rotunda that's round, but it'll be very obvious that it's not at 90 degrees. As I'm measuring, I will note windows, window wells, hose bibs, downspouts, AC units, vents, outlets, gas meter, overhead lines, basically anything that's going to impact my design. Here's kind of what a gas meter looks like, and next to it is what a backflow looks like. Some people don't know what these are if you're kind of new to home ownership or haven't seen them before. That black pipe kind of in the top picture that's extending out, that is a sump. So that is going from the basement of the house, collecting any water from the foundation and pumping that back out. Then there are some vents, whether the dryer vents, heating vents, things like that. And then there's a downspout coming down next to that. That's actually going into a pipe underground. So we always want to note that. The bottom picture is showing some AC units, and again with the downspout. And here's kind of what their backyard looked like. It's very important that you have an accurate plan. If you do not have an accurate plan, your brilliant design may not be worth the paper that you draw it on. If you're not being accurate with the spaces, your patio may be too big or too small. Hardscape is very dependent on the space you have. And if it's not drawn correctly, then it's not going to be right. That's why I do not use plot plans alone to draw anything. I'll hand measure everything myself. Plot plans and improvement lot surveys or ILCs, they're not looking at what we need to be looking at when they draw those up. So I'm very adamant that I'm drawing up my own measurements from my own experiences. And if you have an inaccurate plan, when you go to do the cost estimate, it's also going to be inaccurate. So you're either going to have too few materials, then you're going to have to pay for more shipping to get things out there. Or even worse, if you have too much materials, if you've overestimated a ton or two of rock, that can be very expensive and very hard to get rid of. So here's a project that was done a few years ago, a nice courtyard in front of their house. Doing the pool in the backyard, that was very detailed, and we had to work with the city to squeeze that in. That's where an accurate plan really came into play, so we could show the city that we could meet all their setbacks. So the first step is I walk around the property, and I will kind of look at my game plan and figure out what's going to be hard to measure, what's going to be easy to measure, the size, the shape of the house, and kind of get a general feel for everything. Then I draw the rough footprint of the house, and I typically, again, will use a red pen on graph paper, noting the windows, window wells, downspouts, etc. I use graph paper, but I'm not drawing it to scale. So I'm not actually saying this is a 10-foot line, I've got to go 10 squares over. I'm just trying to get it proportioned. It doesn't have to be to scale. I just need to illustrate it enough so that I can write down my measurements. And then as detailed as possible. So if the patio sticks out 1 or 2 inches from the house, I need to know that. And you pay a lot of attention to where you're starting that measurement and recording where you're starting it from. I usually do that with a 0. Each time I relay down my tape measure. So each time I move my tape measure and lay down a new section, I use a different color pen. And then I will circle the total distance. So here you can see I have a 0 called out, and then I have a 265. That was the length of the front of their house. Different colored pens. Red, again, I'm using for the lines of the drawing. Black, I say for elevation. Black's a real heavy color, and so I use that sparingly. Otherwise, I get kind of overwhelmed with all the other measurements, and you'll see what a mess my drawings get by the end. And so you can see my pocket there with all the different pens in, and now they come in a lot of colors. There's a new orange and green. That's really cool. Other details, so I'm measuring, kind of locating where plants are using common abbreviations like CBS for Colorado Blue Spruce, CPB for Crimson Pygmy Barberry, DBB for Dwarf Burning Bush, LI for Lilac. I'll draw triangles for downspouts, noting kind of where those downspouts are pointing. I'll draw a T for a hose bib. And again, whenever I'm recording measurements, I'll draw arrow back to where that 0 is. So here you can see how messy my drawings get very fast, and how the different colors, you can really focus in on one color and know that all those measurements with that one color were from one base point, and that makes it a lot easier when you're going back to draft. There are basically 3 systems of measurements that I've come up with: offset, triangulation, and chart. So typically I'll lay my tape measure on the ground. I'll start at a 0 origin, and here you can see as I'm going up the face of this house, there's a 21-inch for a window, there's a 41-inch for the other side of the window. The house is bumping out at 116 inches. It's bumping out 9 inches, so that's in a different color. And the total for the face of the house is 265. So hopefully that'll kind of show you how I'm putting a tape measure down once and measuring all these different items. I've also got measurements for the plants and everything else if you look at that in great detail. So I'll measure all the way around the house, and I measure to about a 1/4 inch of accuracy. When you go to draft the house, your measurements should end up where you started. So if you're off by more than 6 inches in either direction, either long or short, you really need to go back and figure out what happened and why you're off. It could be as simple as you started from one place on the brick here and you started from another place on the brick going the other direction, and that kind of accounts for an overlap or the lines not meeting up as in a shortage. But it's very important to kind of figure that out, because everything we're going to do from here, laying out property lines, all is going back to this basic measurement. Next thing I'll do is measure the property corner. So I measure off each corner of the house to the property line. And note, you may not know where the property line is, so you're recording things like fences, sprinkler heads, edger, plants, etc. So anything that you can kind of go back when you're drafting and kind of try to figure out where those property lines are, and then compare that to a plot plan, the ILC certificate, or any information the homeowner has. That's a great way to double check. Measuring 3 times or more to each property line is very helpful, especially if the property lines are at an angle or if the property line angles change. So having multiple measurements to each property line when you go back to draft will be great. A lot of times when you're on site, you're not picking up these little angles and things like that. And so your measurements may get thrown way off and you won't know why. The more measuring, the better. So here's kind of what that looks like. So we're taking points off the corner. The next thing I want to talk about is a vanishing point. So the vanishing point is where you're looking at the corner of a house kind of as an isometric view. So you're seeing both sides of the wall in the corner. And as you move up to be perpendicular to that corner of the house, one of those walls is going to start becoming less seen, less seen, less seen, and then it's going to vanish. And that's a pretty good indication you're at the vanishing point, which means you're perpendicular to that corner of the house, and that's kind of where you go off your line from. Same works with trees and everything else. Houses are great because you really have that long line of vanishing point that you can make sure you're perpendicular. So the offset method. The offset is a system of measuring using a baseline and a distance from that line. So for example, you can have a front yard with a sidewalk. As long as that sidewalk is straight, then you can lay your 100 to 300 foot tape along the sidewalk, and then you're kind of turning yourself perpendicular to each item on that sidewalk or each item in that yard as it relates to that sidewalk and recording those distances. Then you can measure from a secondary from a shorter tape measure, your 35-foot tape measure from that sidewalk to that item. And here's what that will look like. So here I measured the sidewalk, which is 35 feet from where I started, and it's also 39 feet to the other side. Then as we go to 54 feet, you get the corner of the house, which is then 26 feet from the sidewalk. And then the porch itself, there were multiple areas, and so I only measured the distance from the sidewalk to the porch, which was 21 feet. And then you can see the tree on the left-hand side was 65 feet from where I started, and then 20 feet from that sidewalk. The total distance along that street frontage of this property was 95 feet. So the pros to the offset method are it's very fast. The cons are that it requires the site or where you're standing to be true 90 degrees so you get those perpendicular lines. And it cannot be used if there are obstructions to the line of sight. So if you can't see the corner of the house because of a tree or something, you can't measure it. Next thing is triangulation. So this fills in that gap. So triangulation is a method where we use arcs and a known length to find a point. So this is what they're talking about when you're watching CSI and they're trying to triangulate to find somebody's cell phone, and they're using 2 cell towers or more to kind of triangulate to see where the point is that they need to find. Same thing here. So we start with already having measured the house, and then we can go from each corner of the house at this case, and we're going to call it base point 1 and then base point 2. So you start at base point 1 and you're going to measure to an item. You're going to measure to the corner of the fence, to a point on the property line, to a tree, to whatever it is. Then you're going to move your tape measure to the other corner of the house that you know how long those two distances are because you've already measured that. Base point 2, you're going to go back and measure that same point you measured the first time. And using those, that's how you're going to find out where something is. And note, you can measure more than one item at a time. So at base point 1, you might measure 10 items, move to base point 2, and then you're going to measure the same 10 items. Here's kind of what it will look like. So you'll put your, if you're using an old-fashioned compass or can picture an old-fashioned compass, you're going to put the metal point on the corner of the house kind of at the top there, and then you're going to measure that 66 feet, and you're going to draw that big red circle. And then you're going to move your compass to the next point. You know that distance, and so you'll put the metal point of the compass on the next point, which would be the base 2, and then that'll be the 44 foot. And where those two arcs or circles overlap, that is where your point is going to be. So you can see you can just go crazy and measure all sorts of stuff with triangulation. And here's what I'm talking about on this slide. So corner of trees, corner of the house, water meter, fence, sprinkler heads, retaining walls, patios, swing sets. It's endless what you can measure. The pros are it's very accurate. It can be used on irregular sites. The cons are it's quite time consuming. Each point requires 3 measurements. Then we're going to talk about the chart measurement. So this is kind of fills in the gaps that the first 2 systems left. So if you have a curved sidewalk, if you have a curved retaining wall, edger that's curved, something like that, and you need to be very accurate on where that is, you will have to find 2 known points. So you'll have to find 2 points you can find with another system of measurement, and then you'll create a chart. So we're using the same principles as offset, but to a higher degree. So I start typically with a 100-foot tape or a long tape, again to 2 points that I know where they're going to be at. And then I'm going to measure every 2 feet, 5 feet, or 10 feet, depending on what my accuracy needs to be. And then with my 35-foot tape, I'm going to measure at 90 degrees to each one of those, just like that first method of offset. You got to be perpendicular, and then record the distances. So I'll end up with this chart. So at 5 feet, I measured to the left side of the sidewalk, then the right side of the sidewalk. Then at 10 feet, I did the same, 15 feet, 20 feet. And now when I go back, as long as I know where those two original points are, I can draw this in. The cons, or the pros, I should say, are that this is very accurate and can be very fast once you get the hang of it. The cons are it's a bit of a learning curve. So that kind of wraps up the introduction to measuring. I hope you've learned a lot, and thank you very much, and come back for the next video. Bye.